Welcome to Access Spotlight, a PATV program that features people who are of interest in our community. In the studio today is Pauli Libsohn, an author and resident of North Hills. Hello, Pauli.
Hi.
I am so glad to see you again.
I'm so glad to be back.
I've had the pleasure of interviewing Pauli when her first book was published, Immortal Kisses, Confessions of a Poet.
Correct.
Now there's been a few more books.
There's been an explosion.
But why don't you just get our audience up to speed a little bit and tell them about the first book of poems.
The first book is called Immortal Kisses, Confessions of a Poet. And the way that that came about was because my mother and I sat at our kitchen table in Brookville for 35 years, and every day when I would come home, she would have written a new poem. And she'd say to me, "What do you think of this?" And I'd give her my opinion, and then I'd go and I'd type it up. And then I'd have volumes of poems, but yet we never really thought that they were anything. Until one day when I bought a volume of Robert Frost's poetry, and I said, "Oh my God," I said, "my mother's poetry is better than Robert Frost's." So I told her about this. She in turn thought I was a little off, but I said no. I said we have to get a manuscript together. And so I pushed her and I pushed her, and so we worked on this manuscript, and then what happened was she passed away, and she couldn't see this come to fruition. So I had made her a promise, and I promised her that I would publish these poems, and I did.
Well, I've read this book, and we had a whole show.
Yes.
I have to confess, I love poetry.
Yes.
And I don't think that we have enough around today.
Right,
I mean, I have my favorites, but I really enjoyed this. And,
yes.
And I enjoyed...
It's gorgeous, romantic poetry.
Yes.
And what it is that she tells the story of her relationship with my father all through the years. And I never realized that until I was going through the manuscript myself after she had passed, because she always kept that a secret. She always kept that to herself, and she never told me. But then I realized, I said, my goodness, this is really telling a story. And that's what it did. It told the story of her relationship with him from when she first met him all the way up to the end.
But you saw that being their child. You saw that depth of commitment and their love, but you didn't know until you saw all the poems that she actually chronologically went through the years with her poetry.
I never realized it.
And she was able to do it in a very difficult art form.
Yes.
So then came book
number 2, Songs of You, a postscript. And the reason why I named it that was because it was a P.S. to this book. And what happened was that after the Immortal Kisses came out, I was going through all her drawers. And I had never done that before because I always felt that everything was very private.
Sure.
And I felt like I was trespassing. But anyway, I said, to heck with it, I'm going through it. So what did I find? I found a box of all these poems, and one section of that book is fascinating, and the section is Encores of You, because that section is made up of poems that she and my father wrote on the inside of the books that they would exchange throughout their lifetime, because they were avid readers.
All right, let's talk about that a little bit. You grew up in a home that reading was number one.
Correct.
And so how did your mother give you that love of reading? Well, what was her background anyhow, that she was such a voracious
her background,
reader?
Well, it started when she was a little girl. And I feel because she was lonely. She grew up in the Depression, and she had 2 other sisters, but they went their way. She was left really to fend for herself. Her parents did not take care of her, not because they didn't want to, was because they had to work because of the Depression. And also she didn't have that many friends because she was skipped 2 grades.
Yes, it was very
very difficult.
If you were bright enough,
yes.
it was common. Yes.
Yes, so because of the fact that she was so bright, they skipped her, which was a mistake because she went from 7th grade to 9th grade, from 9th grade to 11th grade.
Very difficult.
And she entered Queens College when she was 16. So therefore, the children in her school, they really didn't want to be friends with her because she was too young and she was emotionally undeveloped. So
So what year was this when she entered Queens College?
She entered Queens in 1939.
Oh boy.
And she was 16 at the time.
A time when women were not going to college.
Correct.
Okay, so
Correct.
she had this love of literature, which we're going to get into in a second, because it is basically the beginning of the next book that you wrote, which we're going to talk about today.
Yes.
And I'm excited about that because this is a biography you wrote.
Correct.
And why did you write it?
I wrote it, number one, because everyone was begging me to because of the story that I would always tell when I delivered my lectures at the various schools, and they couldn't get over the story that I had to tell of my mother meeting my father and then their ensuing lives together and what happened. And it's a fascinating story. And so they kept saying, write the book. And finally I sat down and I wrote it. And
I mean, it's wonderful. The story is just It's like this romantic story that these things you can't even imagine.
Right. And you don't hear about this anymore.
No, you don't hear about it. Do you have a favorite poem that maybe you could share with us from the beginning part of all of this?
Well, you know, I have a poem that fascinates me that my mother wrote to my father on their honeymoon.
Okay.
And it shows her deep love of my father and their relationship. And I'd like to read that to you.
Yes, so this will start it off,
Okay.
And show our audience the kind of poetry and the beauty of it and the depth.
Oh. And she didn't have a title for this, so I titled it, Oh, You, My Beloved. She just titled it David.
Who was your father?
Who was my father.
Yes.
Okay. So it starts off, David, oh, you, my beloved, my present and my future, my earliest love, my heart's entirety. I love thee more than all things else. Beloved, I love thee, I love thee. I love thee to all eternity. I love thee to all eternity. What word can answer thine? What speech can tell thee all that my heart is saying silently? Oh, with the fullness of all rapture, fill me. I love thee, I love thee. I love thee to all eternity. I love thee to all eternity. Mitzi.
So in this biography, tell us a little bit about how it started. I think, you know, how they met.
Well, what happened was, it's a fascinating story. My mother, again, with her books. She went to the beach as a 12-year-old girl, and she went every summer during the Depression because her parents couldn't take care of her. So she went with her beloved grandmother, and she stayed with her aunt, and she played on the beach. But she also brought her books.
Now, this was Rockaway Beach?
This was Far Rockaway.
Oh, Far Rockaway,
yes.
Okay.
And she came out of the water one day, and she walked right into my father, who was a lifeguard. And she saw him, and she was dumbfounded. She thought he was so handsome, and she made up her mind at 12 years old, this was the fellow that she was going to marry. Can you imagine?
Love at first sight.
Love at first sight.
But did he know it?
No. He had no idea what was in store for him. And so she had to devise a way of how to capture him. So she figured she was going to bring books to the beach. Now, usually a girl says, well, I'm going to become interested in what the boy is interested in. But no, she was going to make him interested in what she was interested.
Clever.
So she brought these books, and she would sit there and she would talk to him about them. And she would tell him about all these stories, and in a very fascinating way, so that she captured him, and he was captivated by this. And so he actually started to read these books.
Now, how old was your father at this time?
He was 17.
Oh, okay, 5 years older.
Right.
All right.
And you see all the kids on the beach, all the teenagers were kidding him about this. What are you doing talking to a 12-year-old girl? Come on with us, you know.
Yeah.
But yet there was something about my mother that was pulling him, and he could not tear himself away. And so also at the end of the day, she would climb up on the lifeguard's chair with these books, and she would tell him about these stories. And then when the summer would come to an end, she was beside herself because she didn't want to lose touch with him. So what she would do is she would give him books over the winter, and she would assign them to him. And
amazing.
Then they exchanged addresses, and she would write to him, and she would want to know what he thought
Now, where
about
did he
these
live?
books. He lived in the Bronx, and she lived in Forest Hills.
Oh boy.
God. So he went home to to New York University. I'm sorry, he was a business major. And she went home to junior high school in Forest Hills. But yet, he wrote to her, and she wrote to him, and this went on for 5 years.
Amazing.
And they fell in love at the beach. And in Immortal Kisses, the poems that she writes are all about that falling in love. And also in Songs of You, she writes about that.
And he didn't know. Did he know she was writing the poems about him at that time?
Well, no. What happened was those were the poems that she would write when I would come home from post-college every night
the
at
memories,
the kitchen. Right.
The memories of that time.
Right,
Oh,
right.
Okay.
And I didn't know what they were about. I don't even know if my father knew what they were about.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know, because she never told me.
Okay.
I don't know if she ever told him.
So how did they get from the beach to getting married, actually?
So what happened is that somehow they lost touch. I don't know how. They never explained it. They just lost touch. So what happened is that because of the fact that my mother had interested my father in culture, he was very interested in Broadway shows, in the ballet, and in opera. And so he had bought 2 tickets to the ballet, one for himself and one for his mother.
Okay.
And because he was poor and he didn't have that much money, his mother had to cancel that evening. And he did not want to forfeit those tickets. He wanted to get his money back. Oh. So he decided he was going to go into the city that night and exchange the tickets for another evening or get back his money. So at the time, he was working in Queens, and he was on the subway platform, which I can't believe, in Forest Hills,
Okay.
Waiting for the subway to go into the city. At the same time, there was another train coming in the other direction, the subway, and it stopped and it let people off. Who gets off that train but my mother?
Amazing.
Which is incredible.
Yeah.
And I always say it was divine intervention.
Yes.
And she saw him, she ran into his arms, and she screamed. They hugged, they kissed. My father couldn't believe it. And she kept saying, why? And he kept telling her about the tickets for the ballet. And he said, would you like to go? Well, she said, of course. And she grabbed him, and she never let him go. And they went on the subway that he was waiting for. They went into the city. They saw the ballet. They went out to dinner. And he asked her to marry him that night.
Amazing. How old is she
Yes.
at this point?
Well, she got married when she was 23 and my father was 28, but she must have been either 20 or 21
Okay.
at that time.
Okay.
And then she had to go home and announce this to her parents. Now, her mother she came from Austria, and she was of the strict European background, where the eldest daughter had to be married first. And so she was the youngest.
Oh, no.
And no one in the family had married yet. So she came home with this big announcement, and I'm telling you, all hell broke loose. It was unbelievable, and there was all this resistance. And as my mother said to me, it wasn't because my grandmother didn't like my father. It was just because of that crazy rule, the old school rule.
Yes,
you know?
Yeah.
So my mother wasn't allowed to see my father. My father wasn't allowed to come over. No telephone calls would be accepted. So he decided to write her a letter. And he wrote her a letter with no return address. And they decided that she was going to get the ladder from the garage and put it up to her bedroom window and climb down and meet him. And
every element you've just described is so romantic.
Yes, and that's what they did.
And almost unbelievable.
It was a very hard household to grow up in.
All right, without giving too much away, because this book is fascinating.
Right.
They get married. And then
they have a magical honeymoon at the Weirs in New Hampshire. And then they come home to Queens. They lived in Fresh Meadows. And then I arrived.
Okay, that's wonderful.
Right.
And so your father...
he was successful. He had a job at an electronics company, and my mother had a job at Tussie Cosmetics. But what I neglected to say was that after they got married, he was drafted into the Army.
Oh, so they had a part of their life that was
and
with the Army.
She traveled the country with him. She went to every Army base. She never let him go. And she wrote him 2 letters a day, every day.
Oh,
and my father wrote 1 letter. And he always said, don't let those letters stop coming. And he said that that was the only reason how he got through his Army commitment.
Wow. You know, it's such
2 letters a day she wrote to him.
Very interesting, based on literature and writing, which is so key in their life. Now, how many years were they married?
60.
Wow. What was the first book your mother gave you?
So Big by Edna Ferber, and I never forgot it.
And loved it.
It was fabulous. Fabulous.
So you're taking all this literary input that you had from your mother. Your father seems to be quite literary also.
Yes, he was right there.
And now, what has compelled you to do all of this?
Well, I made this promise to my mother that I would publish Immortal Kisses. And then again, I found the second book, quote unquote, and I was driven to do it. Then at the same time after that, I found her box of essays that she had written on books of love that she read throughout her lifetime, which I found to be incredible. And I titled it Silhouettes, Literary Passageways. And I never knew about it.
So now she went to prose.
Yes, and she wrote essays, gorgeous essays.
Now, what is your memory of your mother every night?
Oh, every night. Well, first of all, every night my parents would be in my father's den and they would be discussing their books. Then she would go into their bedroom, she'd get into bed, my father would still be in his den watching television, and she would get into bed with this box that I never paid any attention to. And it was filled with papers, her pens, and then she'd also have with her all her books. And she'd be writing and she'd be reading, and that's what I remember.
Well, that's terrific.
And this is every night, and she was never without a book, and neither was my father. He'd always have a book, and when he would come home, he'd have a book waiting for him on his couch in his den. Always.